Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
One surprising aspect of Jewish response to plague through history is the prominence of the Ketoret. The Ketoret was a special incense that was prepared and used in temple rituals back when we had a temple, but it also had an anti-plague purpose. We'll start by looking at the plague-related appearance of Ketoret in the Torah, and we'll go from there into a little bit of an exploration of what Ketoret is, what various authorities thought Ketoret was about, and then some surprising historical turns in the history of Ketoret as a response to, as a Jewish response to plague. You have in front of you in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, the people sinned. As a result of their sin, they're being punished. Well, the punishment takes the form of a plague that's raging through the Israelite camp in the desert. But Yomer Moshe el Aaron, Moshe says to Aaron, Moses says to Aaron, take the fire pan, put fire on it from on the altar, and place incense, Ketoret. And then go quickly to where the people are and make atonement for them. Because wrath has gone forth from before the Lord, the plague has begun. So Aaron took the fire pan exactly as Moses had told him to. He ran to where the people were, where the plague had begun. He placed the incense, he put it down, and he made an atonement, an expiation for the people. He stood between the dead and the living, and he was standing exactly where the plague was spreading. Batei atzar hamagefa, the plague was checked. He stopped the plague by burning incense. Now, firstly, the Ketoret, what was in the Ketoret? What was it used for? So in the book of Shemot, we have a commandment. When God is giving us all of the commandments regarding the tabernacle, all of the different furniture and all of the different garments that were worn by the priests and the high priest, it also describes the Ketoret. It describes this incense. God says to Moshe, Shemot, Exodus chapter 30, verse 34, that should be 34 to 38. Kach lecha samim, take these herbs, take these ingredients, and it describes them, and there's a lot of debate exactly what they are. Nataf, which is some sort of, as the word indicates, some sort of drippy thing, some sort of sap or resin. Shechelet, chelbena, samim, ulevona zaka, pure frankincense, bad bevad yiyeh. And you should make it into an incense, refined and blended and pure and holy. You should grind it very, very thin, and then you place from it before the edut, before the testimony, before the aron, before the holy ark, in the Ohel Moed, and it should be super holy, right? It can't be used for anything else. It can only be used for these ritual purposes. And it has to be prepared in a very specific way. Other ingredients can't be added. Eitash isha sher ya'aseh kamoha, if somebody makes incense for other purposes, lahariach ba, such as for its scent, b'nicharat me'amav, that person will be cut off from his people. And actually, a little bit earlier, it describes the vessel where this would happen, that in the main sanctuary, in the main part of the sanctuary of the tabernacle, there was an altar that was made out of gold. Every morning, right? Hiktir alav Aaron ketoret samim baboker. Every morning, Aaron or the subsequent high priests would burn incense on it. And every afternoon. Lo ta'alu alav ketoret zara. You couldn't burn any other incense on it. Va'olah umincha v'nesech lo tisku alav. You couldn't pour any libations on it. V'chiper Aaron al karnotav achat b'shana midam chatat kippurim. Now it adds something else, that once a year there was a special service that involved the incense and this altar that stood in the center of the sanctuary facing the ark on Yom Kippur. And part of the central worship of Yom Kippur was placing blood on the corners of this altar, and also burning incense in the center of in front of the ark itself, right? And the Ketoret, it's supposed to somehow resemble a cloud, and whenever God appears in the Torah, it's usually within a cloud, right? So the Ketoret, as it blooms and blossoms and it becomes a cloud and fills up space, just like as it was when God would appear. So now that's all fine and good. And this Ketoret, it sounds like a very fascinating, perhaps archaeological project, historical project. What exactly was it? Comparative religious project. But the odd thing is, okay, where do we get this plague thing from? How is it that Moses knew that, quick, there's a plague? Aaron, grab the fire pan. We've got to go burn incense. That'll stop the plague. Where did he get that from? How did he know that? So there's a Gemara, Shabbat Daf Pei Tet. Those passages in the Gemara talk about how when Moses went to get the Torah, he was up there on Sinai, and the angels didn't want to let the Torah go. The angels wanted to keep the Torah for themselves. So Moses had to debate them. And the Talmud records all sorts of debates that Moses had with the angels to prove to them, to demonstrate that really the Torah belongs with us human beings, right? The Torah says things like, don't covet or don't steal. Like, who are the angels going to steal from? And angels don't covet. It all speaks to human realities. And that's part of Moses's debate. And at the end, he bests the angels. And the angels become his buddies, and they all compliment him, and they all give him gifts before he's sent back to the land of us mortals. Even the angel of death, the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us that even the angel of death gave one of these gifts to Moses. He didn't give him any physical gift. He told him a secret. What was the secret? That incense has anti-plague properties. Af malcha mavet masar lo davar. The angel of death also gave Moses something. Shne'emar vayitena et haktoret vayichaper al ha'am. Aaron burned the Ketoret at Moses' instruction, and he atoned for the people, and it stopped the plague. The Omer vayamod ben hametim uben hachayim ve'atzara magefa. The plague stopped. Where did Moses get this from? If lavda amarle, if not for the angel of death telling him, how could he have possibly known? So now, how exactly this works, what are the mechanics of this? It doesn't say. We don't really know. But there are let's say there are two main perspectives as to what exactly the Ketoret was. What's the symbolism of the Ketoret? One of them, it's in a very terse form in a Midrash Tanchuma, and then it's developed to a much greater degree in the Zohar. The Midrash Tanchuma says, speaking of this episode, Re'ei kama chaviv haktoret. See how beloved the Ketoret. The word chaviv means it's beloved. That God loved the Ketoret. Sha'al yedei haketoret ne'etzra hamagefa. It was through it that the magefa, that the plague was stopped. So the idea here is that God so loves the smell of the Ketoret, or so loves what the Ketoret represents, that when he sees the Ketoret, when he as it were, smells the Ketoret, he can no longer be angry. The Zohar, which is, as is known as written in Aramaic, also develops this further, right? And a lot of the ideas of the Zohar are elaborations of ideas that appear in very terse form in Midrashim. It says, Tachazi maktiv, look at what it says, and then it quotes the verse about Aaron. My time, oh, what's going on here? The plague started because God got angry. And because there's nothing that can break that mood or that sitra, that aspect, that side, bar Ketoret, except for Ketoret. Ketoret is the only thing, it's like God's comfort food, as it were. It's the only thing that can put God's mood back where it was. Because there's nothing more beloved to God than the Ketoret. And v'kaima lebatla harashin umalin bishin mibeta. You can use it. It can get rid of all kinds of terrible things at home. And you can see, and here's a proof. And now here, this gives us a little bit of an inkling of what's the idea behind this, the Ketoret, the smell of the Ketoret, or the burning of the Ketoret being anti-plague. You see that if there's a bad smell, if there's a stench in the house, then if you take the Ketoret that human beings made, it can get rid of, it can disperse those bad smells. And if that's something that human beings made, then certainly the Ketoret, that's the ingredients, the recipe that was given to us by God, can disperse plague. And the Zohar goes on to say that God decreed, there's a decree from God, Kol man de istakel v'kari b'chol yoma uvda de Ketoret. Anybody who reads about the making of the Ketoret every day, and it does appear in pretty much every Sidur, most famously on Shabbat after Musaf, you have that Pitum HaKetoret after Ein Kelokenu. That's what it's talking about, that Pitum HaKetoret. And there are people that say it every day after Shacharit, and there are people that say it also every day before Shacharit in the Korbanot section. And there are also people who say it every day before Mincha. So anybody that reads the how to make the Ketoret every day will be saved from all terrible things. Okay. Now, there is a little bit of a connection here to what Rambam says. Rambam, famously rationalist, talks in Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, he talks about why there's a mitzvah to burn the Ketoret every morning and every evening. And he says, pretty simply, it smells good and animal carcasses smell bad. So you want to burn something that smells nice in order to get rid of the smell of the animal carcasses. Now, of course, there are some that challenge the Rambam on this and say like, okay, but to say that if you add an extra ingredient or that you can't use anything else, why does it have to be this special Ketoret? That indicates that there's something more going on them, something that's more non-rational, something mystical, something about something theological. What is it about God that he loves this Ketoret? So you have those two basic approaches, the rational approach where the purpose of the Ketoret is to make sure that the temple doesn't stink. And you have the approach that it expresses something that's really and truly beloved to God, and that it has these properties that it can't keep God in a bad mood. We're going to turn now, right? We've seen the Torah, we've seen what the Torah says, we've seen what the rabbinic era says in the Gemara, in the Midrash Tanchuma. We've now seen some things from the from the medieval era, such as Rambam, and such as this is when the Zohar was revealed. We won't get into the question of the authorship of the Zohar, but it became known only in the 1200s. And now we turn to the early modern era. And there's a few things that happen in the early modern era that allow us to see a turn in how the Ketoret is used. So first, you have a responsum from the Radbaz. Radbaz lived in the 1500s in the land of Israel as well as in Egypt. Actually, here's my little shelfie. Here's the Radbaz, the responsa of the Radbaz. He penned thousands of responsa, answers to questions mainly from the areas where he lived. And he was asked about burning incense in homes. And he basically says, well, it depends why you do it. And this is a summary of the paragraph that you have in front of you is a little summary of what his little taxonomy of the purposes of burning incense. It says, Liktoret habayit v'lavona bizman hadever, and then he has in parentheses Reish Lamed, which is Rahman al-Itzlan. To burn incense, to burn specifically frankincense in the home, in the house, in the home, during a pestilence, kimosha anu nohagim, which is what we do. So here we see that in the medieval era, they would burn incense to ward off plague. In the early modern era, they would burn incense to ward off plague. Kimosha anu nohagim, which is what we do. Mutter, it's permissible because it's clear that that's what you're using it for. There's a plague going on, so that's why you use it. And then he says, gimel mine kitoret. There are three reasons that one would want to burn incense. One, lekabetz et hashedim v'lachufam, right? One of them is to gather demonic forces so as to bind them and command them. So if you're trying to do it to gain control over these demonic forces, that's forbidden at the biblical level. That's a capital crime, chayav mita. That's category number one. Category number two, lahavricham, o liktoret habayit stam. If you light incense, you burn incense in the house to ward off demons, well, now you're not worshiping the demons, or you're not using the demons, you're just trying to keep them away. So that's not the same level of prohibition, but it's still prohibited. O liktoret habayit stam, or just because you like the smell. Oh, hanashim hamikatrot haichal, or if you're talking about the women who burn incense in the heichal, some sort of sanctuary. I'm not sure exactly what type of sanctuary this is talking about. Could be that they just burned them in synagogues. Patur, you're not liable for anything. It's certainly not a capital crime, avol asur, but it's still prohibited. But l'haktir l'havir reach ra, in order to burn it, in order to remove a stench, olahavir ipush ha'avir. Now that's a key term. To get rid of the rotten air. I'm going to have a better translation for that in a second. Bisman hadever, during a time of pestilence or plague, harei ze mutar. That is permissible. Now that term, ipush ha'avir, it starts showing up in the late medieval and early modern era in rabbinic texts, and it's pretty clearly a translation of the term miasma. Miasma literally also means bad air or rotten air. Before germ theory took hold in the 1800s, the prevailing theory as to how disease spreads is that it spreads through the air, through bad air. That disease is caused by foul air or bad air. Even the disease malaria comes from mal air, bad air. So this miasma, the way to counteract it is by bringing in good air. And the truth of the matter is that you see already in, from the late medieval, early modern era, the 1400s, the 1500s, all the way through to the 1800s, you have people talking about burning incense or the importance of fresh air, the importance of opening windows, the importance of getting rid of stench in fighting disease. In Jewish sources and non-Jewish sources, that was the reigning paradigm for what plague was and how plague spread. Now, this allows for an interpretation back in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud, I'm not sure if the Talmud was aware of miasmatic theory, but here you have this idea that plague, that the angel of death told Moses a secret, and the secret is that incense wards off plague. And here you have an early modern theory of disease and the spread of disease that actually comports with that, that actually seems to corroborate that. It's about bad air, and burning incense creates good air. Now, of course, that would say, as the Zohar said, you see that it works, and it could be that the Zohar is in the late 1200s, could be already talking about a miasmatic theory where you see it works with human, incenses, with human scents. So it could certainly work with, so he doesn't deny the mystical component, the component that, that the idea that incense is truly beloved by God. But he's saying it even works with human incenses. So another thing that happened in this era, starting in the 1400s and the 1500s, is you started to have, well, first of all, plague returns in full force to European consciousness, to human consciousness, not just European, in 1348, 1349, with the Black Death. And soon after that, you start finding these plague manuals, right? People were doing whatever they could to ward off, to try to fight plague. And there are all kinds of medical texts, and there are also these ritual texts. And sometimes you have them in the same text. Sometimes you'll have a Hebrew text that has a ritual dimension and a scientific dimension, and it's not clear that they ever even differentiated those two as neatly as we do. You'll have it all you'll have it all in the same sort of texts. So, and these also, they became popular in the early modern era. And during the COVID era, they've remained popular. There have been a whole bunch of new printings of these sorts of books, a Seder HaKetoret, which is a series of prayers centered on the Ketoret that are recited during times of plague. Now, I am going to show you a couple of these plague manuscripts. Now, there are dozens of manuscripts all over the world, from Ashkenazic areas, from Sephardic areas. They're everywhere. And a number of them have now been digitized and are available for viewing online. There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of differences. I think it would be an interesting comparative study to see what's in some and what's not in, and what's in others, and what's not. But here, I want to look at two. One of them, this is the earliest one that I found, and it's missing some pieces, right? This manuscript is in Parma, in Italy. Now, you see the two different handwritings. It seems as though there are missing pages in this book that were taken out, and that this part right here, the lighter handwriting, that it starts like in the middle of several passages on plague, right? So here, the first word that you see is yaktirena, which is the end of a verse. He shall burn it, he shall burn the incense. And then it says gimel pa'amim. You recite that verse 3 times. Uveha'alot aharon et hanerot bein ha'arbayim, right? So these are the verses that we saw from Exodus. When Aaron lights the flames in the afternoon, yaktirena, he should burn the incense again. Ketoret tamid, right? An everyday, a daily incense offering, lifnei Hashem, before the Lord, lidorotechem, for all generations. Gimel pe'amim. And you recite that verse also 3 times. The idea of reciting a verse 3 times is you have that in these ritualistic, even magical type of text where you're saying it as though you say a formula. It works as though magic words work, right? You have to say it 3 times, and that reinforces whatever properties this has. But what you have here is the displacement of the actual bringing of the Ketoret, the actual burning of the Ketoret in the temple, something which is forbidden to us today. You have the replacement with the recitation of the Ketoret, the recitation of the passages of scripture that pertain to the Ketoret. This manuscript is from the 1400s, right? So this is again, late medieval, early modern. It really starts to explode in the late 1500s after the Kabbalah of the Arizal, which spread from Tzfat, and after the printing of the Zohar, mysticism became a something that was much more known to the masses. Right? So you have these recitation of verses. Here it's only a couple of pages, and then it goes on to the rabbinic teachings about the Ketoret, Pitum HaKetoret Ketzad, how is the Ketoret made? The same sort of thing that you can find in any Siddur. And it goes on, and then it has a couple of petitionary prayers. Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, Bizman Shebeit HaMikdash Kayam, Haya Kohen Gadol Maktir Lefanecha Et Korban HaKetoret HaSamim. When the temple stood, the high priest would burn before you the sacrifice, and it adds that word sacrifice. It's a sacrificial offering of this Ketoret. Hayita Otzer HaMagefa. And through that, you would stop the plague. When that happened, you would stop the plague. Kakatuv b'Toratecha, as it says in your Torah, and then it goes on to tell the story about Moses and Aaron and stopping the plague. I'm gonna stop sharing this manuscript just to show another manuscript from a couple of hundred years later, and you'll see that they're very similar. This one's gonna be a lot easier to read. This manuscript, from several hundred years after the first one, this is at the JTS library. Now, the other one is about 75 pages. It's a miscellany. It's got all kinds of stuff in it. This is a dedicated prayer manual. The only thing in this book is anti-plague prayer. It begins with several chapters of Tehillim. Chapter 91, Yoshev B'Seter Elyon, which is also, it's famous. It talks about God saving us from demonic forces. It has some weird verses that really don't seem to be connected at all, which probably indicates that they have some sort of magical significance. Like, for example, it has the verse about when the angels visited Abraham when he was recovering from his circumcision. It says, "Vayimaer Avraham ohala el Sarah." Abraham hurried to his tent to Sarah, Vayomer, and he said, "Mahari, hurry up, shlosh se'im kemach solet, take 3 measures of fine flour, lushi, knead it, ba'asi ugot, and make cakes." That lushi was a shout out to my friend Yoni. Yoni, you know who you are. That was for you. And then it says, Gimel pa'amim, do that 3 times, recite that 3 times. And then another one talks about when the Israelite spies came back from, or were sent out to spy on the land of Israel before they entered, and they cut down branches. What's it doing here? I don't know. It had some sort of significance to the person that wrote this manuscript, that wrote this plague manual, and they included it in what they thought should be used to ward off plague. Then it goes into the stuff that we're familiar with, even though it's in a different order. Ribono shel olam, bizman shebeit hamikdash haya kayam, when the temple stood, etc., etc. And he says, now we have nothing. Now, because of our sins, charev beit mikdashenu, our temple is destroyed. Batla avodah, its service has been nullified. Ein lanu, we have no lo mizbeach, lo karban, we have no altar, we have no sacrifice. Lo ketoret hasamim, we don't have the incense. Lo kohen gadol, we have no high priest. Shechaper ba'adenu, we have no high priest to atone for us. Ella siach sifsotenu, all we have is our lips, the words that we utter. Kemoshe ne'amar, as the verse says, unishalma farim sfatenu, that our lips will replace the cows that were once brought on the altar. Lachein anu mazkirim lefanecha karban ketoret hasamim. That's why we invoke before you the bringing of the ketoret. And then it goes from there into the biblical verses from Exodus. And then it has the rabbinic teachings on how it was made. And then it concludes, right? This is all rabbinic teaching. It concludes with another, almost like a petitionary prayer. Again, Ribono shel olam. It starts with that formula, Master of the world. Bizman shebeit hamikdash haya kayam, haya kohen gadol maktir lefanecha karban ketoret hasamim u'mechaper al amcha Yisrael. And then it repeats. The temple's destroyed, and all we have is Siach Siftotenu Shneamar Nishal Farim Sfatenu, almost an exact repeat of the opening prayer. So that opening prayer bookends the Torah passages and the rabbinic teaching. And it says, this is a shorthand, Yehi Ratzon, it's an acronym, Yehi Ratzon Lefanecha Hashem Elokeinu V'Elokei Avotenu, may it be your will, God of our fathers, our God and the God of our fathers, of our ancestors, Shehei Zichron Finu Mikubal, that the utterances, the invocation of our lips should be accepted before you, as though we brought the Ketoret itself, and please end this plague. And this prayer continues. And these sorts of prayers, you have them, they're constant from the 1400s until today. I've seen several versions of these sorts of prayer manuals published this year. They were making the rounds. They were on WhatsApps. This is what the Khatam Sofer used to say, and this is what Rabbi Akiva Eger used to say, and this is what Elli Melech of Dinav used to say. And so that's how the Ketoret is used today. I want to go into one more turn, one more historical turn. So we've sort of seen how the Ketoret has gone from a ritual practice in the temple into a text that's being recited. But there's another turn, which is that it has gone again from being the recited text to being something which is performed. What do I mean by that? If you see this pipe here, now I think this metal part is made out of silver, but otherwise it doesn't seem to be like a particularly ornate or valuable looking pipe. It happens to be that that pipe was the pipe that was used by an early Hasidic master called the Yid of Pshischa, the holy Jew of the Polish city of Pshischa. That pipe was on auction a couple of years ago. The opening bid, it ended up not being sold, but the opening bid was $100,000. You could not buy that for less than $100,000. If you wanted to buy it, it would probably cost a lot more than $100,000. These other objects and these other pictures are from a book by Batsheva Goldman Ida called Hasidic Art and the Kabbalah, specifically the chapter called The Hasidic Pipe and Snuff Box. And that brings us to the last turn. Now, there was, and here again, you have an early modern turn. This is the later part of the early modern era. It really starts in the 1700s. A particular product, several products, took the European market by storm. These are products that today we think of as being ubiquitous parts of our culture. Then they weren't. These are products like coffee and tea and tobacco. And the truth of the matter is you could probably add sugar to the mix. I mean, we do add sugar to the mix. You could add sugar as another one of these products that really, it stormed the markets in the early modern era and completely changed lifestyles. Now, like many products, right? So Jews, like everybody else, started drinking coffee and started smoking. And soon, quite soon after they started consuming these products, they had ritualized them. Now, there's a famous study by Elliot Horowitz about the effect of coffee on Jewish rituals. That when people started drinking coffee, they started staying up later at night and they started waking up later in the morning. I think that there's other aspects going. Timekeeping is a key element of that, and the regulation of timekeeping is part of that as well. And lighting, how much it costs to light a city street, those are all factors there. But coffee was a major factor on these habits that people had. And so he proves that there were midnight rituals and there are early morning rituals. There, within the Jewish corpus, you have midnight rituals, tikkun chatzot, and the like, and you have early morning rituals like davening vatikin, or you have certain rituals that are supposed to be done either really, really late at night or really, really early in the morning. So initially it was people would wake up really early to do them, like slichot, but then at a certain point it became that people stayed up really late to do them, right? And you had rituals like staying up all night on Hoshana Rabbah or on Shavuot, and he documents how these things all are majorly affected by the consumption of coffee. That as coffee spreads through Europe, these nocturnal rituals, he calls them, expand and become more popular. However, drinking coffee itself did not become a ritual, right? The drinking of coffee itself was not, there's no special bracha, there's no special, right? My Pepsi Max, it gets the job done just as well as coffee does. There's no drinking coffee ritual. Right? It affects ritual and it becomes part of ritual life and part of religious life, but it's not, imbibing coffee is not any more or less religiously significant intrinsically than drinking a different beverage. That's not the case when it comes to tobacco. Tobacco sort of took on a religious life of its own. Now, this started earlier. You already see things like this with, in the circles around Shabtai Tzvi in the late 1600s. There's some interesting texts that talk about donme, right? These crypto-Sabbatians that they used to smoke, and that it had ritual significance. My advisor, Maoz Kahana, has shown how they ritualized it as the idea of a smoke screen. And that's all that was their entire identity, was creating a smoke screen, that they were one thing outwardly, but a different thing inwardly. And so the idea of having like a smoke bomb so that people wouldn't see what's really going on inside very much resonated with them, and they internalized it and ritualized it. I'm going to focus more on the Hasidic world. So in this book, Rachamei Av, which was published it was written by one of the rabbis of Chust today in the Ukraine. It was part of Greater Hungary in that little tale of what the former Czechoslovakia, now the westernmost part of the Ukraine, it was the easternmost part of Czechoslovakia, called Transcarpathia, a fascinating tiny little area that became heavily Hasidic, and a particular strain, a particular mood of Hasidut developed there. So the rabbi in Chust, Rabbi Yaakov Katina, who passed away in 1890, he wrote an ethical treatise. These are good ideas. This is good ethical behavior. And he says, Ita basvarim. It says in the books, right? Which means I couldn't find exactly the book I was looking for, but I've heard it and I know that this is something that people have said for a long time. B'shem Talmidei Habesht. And it said in the name of the students, the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov. Ki etzel hatzadikim, that for the righteous, for the tzaddik, right, that key figure in Hasidic thought, halaat ashan, that raising of smoke, shekorin reicherin, that we call smoking, right? Reich in German and in Yiddish is smoke. Chashuv k'ketoret, it's considered like the ketoret. Smoking is like burning the incense. V'yesh nitzotzin dakin. There are these very subtle sparks, these very subtle divine fragments. Asher efshar laha'alot. Now, a key idea of Hasidut is to find these mundane sparks and raise them. And one of the compelling ideas of Hasidut is that we serve God through the mundane. We eschew ascetic practices. We actually participate in this world. We enjoy this world, but we do that. What we do is we connect those actions to God and to the divine. And so smoking, what does that do? There are certain very subtle aspects, elements of divinity in this world. They can't be sublimated by eating. They're already too sublime to be sublimated by eating. But they can be raised through the smoking of them or through inhaling them, through smelling them. But then he makes very, very clear, because this is, after all, an ethical treatise. That's talking about really the greatest people in the generation. Everything they do is for the sake of heaven. But when it comes to these young men with these kids, these adolescents, this is nothing but pridefulness. It's hubris. It's arrogance, right? It's just to look cool. And it's excessive expense, right? So he's saying that it's an unnecessary, excessive. It's an expensive habit, guys. The ibud hazman, and it's a waste of time, right? When you're sitting in the Beit Midrash, you leave to go for a smoking break. You're wasting time, right? So he says that yes, there is this spiritual, mystical component of smoking, but that's not for the masses. Not everybody can do that. And this idea, and we know with the Ketoret as well, the Ketoret was brought only in that specific place in the center of the temple, only by a priest, or on Yom Kippur by the high priest. And now we take this even further, right? So now we have, in Hasidut, we have this reinversion that the Ketoret has gone from ritual to text, and now it's going back from text to ritual. It's being re-ritualized as the tzaddik smoking, right? And that starts to explain why the Yid of Pshischa's pipe is going to cost $100,000, and why you can go onto auction sites today and you can find snuff boxes and other smoking artifacts from various tzaddikim, from various Hasidic rebbes, and they go for a pretty penny, and they remain heirlooms for generations. Another book, now we take this a step further. This is the second to last step. This book is called Kol HaKatuv L'Chaim, and it's a collection, it's an anthology of traditions pertaining to the first Sanzer Rebbe, Rabbi Chaim Halberstam of the Polish city of Novi Sad, which is south of Krakow, in the same general area, in the area that was called Galicia, between, in the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. The Sanzer Rebbe lived in the 1800s. He died in 1876. And this is a story told by one of his disciples. And obviously in Hasidut, much of the teaching circulates as stories. Pam achat haya ha-Gitter Yud, right? The Gitter Yud was a nickname. It means the good Jew. The good Jew is the author of this is the grandfather of the author of this compilation. And he had a connection with the Sanzer Rebbe. With Sanz. So the Gitter Yud, the good Jew, was in Sanz. Im Harav HaKadosh Baal Tiferet Shlomo Miradomsk, with the Radomsker Rebbe, who wrote the book Tiferet Shlomo. Ukisheba'u lekabel shalom, when they went to greet the Sanzer Rebbe, these two men, the Gitter Yud and the Tiferet Shlomo, went to greet the Sanzer Rebbe. Lo yachlu likanes. They couldn't get in. They couldn't go in. He was not willing to receive them. V'sha'al oto Tiferet Shlomo, im pitcho shel harav ptucha. The Tiferet Shlomo asked if the Rebbe's door is open. Ki pitcho shel kadosh ze lo haya me'olam sagur, because this holy man's door was never closed. He was always willing to receive visitors. Madua ein yecholim lageshet el hakodesh pnima. How come we can't approach the inner sanctum, right? And you hear already, before we even get to the smoking, lageshet el hakodesh pnima is already borrowing from terms that have to do with the temple, as though the Rebbe is where the Rebbe sits, the Rebbe's home, the Rebbe's place is a temple. And the Rebbe's room within that is the inner sanctum of the temple. So we can't go into this inner sanctum. Why? Because at that time, the Rebbe was profoundly connected. He was cleaving profoundly to God. The Heshiv HaGitter Yud Larav Meradomsk, the Gitter Yud, the Gitter Yid, the good Jew, said to the Rebbe of Radomsk, Ein atem yodim, don't you know? That when the Rebbe is smoking his pipe, he directs his mind. He has these intentions, right? These mystical intentions, as though he is the high priest on Yom Kippur. So the high priest burning the incense on Yom Kippur is akin to the tzaddik who's sitting in his house. And obviously, if it's the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, nobody else can enter. The Kohen Gadol has to enter that sanctum alone. So too, the Rebbe, when he's smoking, nobody else can go in. And now we have a final turn. We started by talking about plague. When we came to Chassidut, we diverged from plague a little bit by showing how for Chassidim, in certain ways of thinking amongst Chassidim, and all three of these sources are from that area of southern Poland, western Ukraine, eastern Slovakia, northern Hungary, northeast Hungary, right? That area of the eastern part of what used to be Hungary, that's where these ideas are circulating. So now we have this final idea. This is reported in the name of a Hasidic rabbi who was also a great Talmud. The Divrei Chaim, the Sanzer Rebbe was also a great Talmid Chacham. He has a work of responsa which shows that he was not limited to the mystical areas. He also, was entirely extremely well versed in the legal aspects of the Jewish tradition. And so this sage that I'm about to quote, Rabbi Chaim Yosef Gottlieb, who wrote a book called Tiv Gittin V'Kiddushin, that's the only book that he left, he's known mostly not for his mystical teachings, but he also had something else. So he was the rabbi in the city of Stropkov, which is today in eastern Slovakia, not far from Sanz. And he had a connection with Sanz, and the city of Stropkov was very much part of the Sanz orbit. And so this is reported by one of his descendants. Ba'et sheshalta magefat hacholira, when the plague of cholera, when the cholera pandemic was rampaging, sheipila chalalim rabim rachmana litzlan, and it caused many deaths. Now, cholera was the scourge of the 19th century. There were outbreaks from the 1820s, maybe even earlier, all until the 1870s, the 1880s. It's extremely well documented. It was also the reason for some of the main developments in modern epidemiology was part of this fight against cholera. Cholera was the scourge of the 19th century. So there was a cholera epidemic raging, and there were these waves of cholera. And when it would come, it's a horrible disease. It affects the digestive tract. So you can imagine that it's not pretty. So what happened? cholera is rampaging. Cholera is ravaging the countryside. What did this rabbi do? Hayadarko Bakodesh, this Rabbi Chaim Yosef Gottlieb, what he would do is Lisoveit Berchovot Ha'ir Kol Halayla. He would walk the city streets all night, Hayam Ashen Miktarto, while smoking his pipe. Pamachat Ra'uhu Be'emtza Halaylo. One time they saw him in the middle of the night. Ichsha Rodev Mishahu Lachutz La'ir. And he saw him chasing someone out of the city. V'amar alav, and he said about him, Shahaya Samach Mem, that person that he was chasing out of the city, that was the angel of death. That was Satan himself. Umini az v'hala netzra hamagefa. And from that point on, the plague stopped. He smoked, he walked around. It's almost like he walked around the streets of the city, smoking his pipe. And by doing that, he was spreading this anti-plague. He was warding off plague with his smoking. And indeed, as Rabbi said of himself before he died, Baruch Hashem, ich bin gewein a guter Getreier Shomer far die Stadt. Baruch Hashem, thank God, I was a good guardian for this city. So now we have come full circle. From the Ketoret being a temple ritual to a way to ward off plague. From there, it became an anti-plague prayer. And then we return to the active part of it, the smoking tobacco by a holy person as an instantiation of the bringing of the Ketoret. And finally, too, the idea that when a tzaddik smokes, right, when a holy person smokes, it has these anti-plague properties, and that a man could protect his city by walking its streets while smoking his pipe. I hope that this has given some insight into a particular set of texts and practices with a long history in the Jewish tradition about how we respond to and how we ward off plague. And it's important to remember that, these things, the tradition is not entirely continuous. Over the years, it's absorbing ideas. It's absorbing the fact that we no longer have incense, and it absorbs miasmatic theory, ideas about how plague spreads, and it absorbs tobacco, as tobacco is ritualized once it comes on the European markets in the 1700s and the 1800s. And this continues even until today. You can find people who have any of these ideas. Any and all of these ideas are still in practice, are still current in the Jewish world, in practice and in thought.